Hello and welcome to the IEA channel for this week's episode of The Definite Article. I'm Emma Revel, Head of Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and this week's episode is a 2-for-1, buy one get one free special, soon to be banned by a government decree, so get it while you can. Tonight I'm joined by Mark Littlewood, IEA Director General, to discuss his fortnightly column in The Times. This week's piece argues increased public sector spending puts an even greater burden on the private sector, highlighting the ballooning cost of state pensions as a result of the triple lock, above inflation public sector pay increase for almost 1 million workers, and a likely lockdown in private sector growth, reducing tax receipts for the Treasury. We're also joined by our colleague Christopher Snowden, Head of Lifestyle Economics, who will be giving us his thoughts on the government's plans to tackle obesity. But before we get started, just a reminder that if you've got any questions for us, you can stick them in the comments box. And don't forget to subscribe to the IEA channel while you're here to make sure you don't miss out. Welcome, Mark, Chris, thanks for joining me. Mark, we're going to start with your piece for The Times. Take us through your article briefly. Why did you pick this topic? I mean, there's been no shortage of headlines to grab the attention of an avid free marketeer this week.
Well, that's the hardest question of all, Emma. How do I select my topic each fortnight? That's a much harder question than my thoughts about public sector pay. I guess what irked me a bit was the coverage around the 3.1% pay rise for 900,000 public sector workers that was universally sort of applauded as a good thing. And look, if you take an alternative view, it does make you sound like Scrooge, right? I mean, I would like everybody to earn more money, be paid more, be better remunerated, get a pay rise every year, whether you're a doctor, a nurse, a judge, a cleaning lady, whatever. But what shocked me about it, and obviously high public spending and deficit finance spending has been a perennial concern for free market types and certainly for fiscal hawks like me since the banking crash of 2008. Was I thought that there was a complete detachment from reality about where this money was going to come from. There was just a sense that sort of people deserved it. That was Rishi Sunak's statement. In fairness, the Chancellor did follow the advice of an independent pay board, but there's this sort of Politburo or committee that works out what you deserve because you've helped us out in this time of national crisis or whatever it might be. And desert doesn't seem to me to be the appropriate way of always setting pay. It's something that you would bear in mind. You know, have you worked supremely hard over the course of the pandemic? Although I would have thought that would be covered by overtime payments for a good number of people, not by a pay rise. But there didn't seem to be any kind of consideration of whether the money was there to pay for it. I mean, they're saying it's going to come out of existing budgets. I'm not totally sure I believe that, to be honest. The government's not very good at staying to target. And it seemed to me that we've got this sort of split, I hesitate to call it an apartheid, but a very different treatment of people in the private sector and the public sector. Lots of people in the private sector deserve a pay rise for their heroic behaviour over the course of the pandemic. So in my article, I highlight, van man, truck drivers, the people who kept the supermarkets open. Absolutely amazing that supply chains to keep us fed and watered have operated so well. I'm not so sure they will get a pay rise. They might, but there won't be some independent supermarket panel that will determine every checkout assistant should get 3%. If the economy goes into tailspin, the private sector suffers, and the public sector seems to a large extent to be insulated from it, or at least not sufficiently plugged into it. So I wanted to highlight that whether public sector workers deserve this or not is, in my view, not really the question. The question is who is going to pay for it. And if we're going to see the economy contract by, 10, 15, 20%, God knows what it will be, the fact of the matter is there is less money to spend on public sector activities, and that just doesn't seem to be a consideration for policymakers and the government at present.
I mean, this is very true. People who would argue that actually the public sector pay increases are justified, it's two-part. It's the part that you've just mentioned, these are workers who've kept the country safe, put their lives on the line during the pandemic. It's our duty to show our appreciation in giving them a pay rise, but also that actually under the public sector pay freeze that we've had during austerity since 2010, this this pay rise is actually long overdue, even setting aside the pandemic. What do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it's a question of what you mean by overdue. I ruminate. I mean, if the government's receipts are low, it is extremely difficult to pay government workers more. And let me just touch on the issue of desert, because I'm not pretending that I know how hard how hardworking or diligent or conscientious or risk-taking the 900,000 people were who have been awarded a pay rise of up to 3.1%. I'm surprised to learn that the judiciary have been on the front line, risking life and limb to keep us alive. But there you go. And of course, nurses aren't included in this particular pay round. So, to my mind, it isn't a question of desert, it's a question of government receipts. And the truth of the matter is that over the past 10 or 12 years, we have had sluggish economic growth. It took us forever and a day to get back to pre-banking crisis levels. Let's hope we bounce back to pre-pandemic levels quickly. But if you don't, the reality is the private sector pays for the public sector. So if you were just to hypothesize a situation in which the economy shrinks by X%, I'm not a forecaster, maybe 5%, maybe 10, maybe 15%, you simply can't have the same level of policing and schools and hospitals and transport and art subsidies and local government funding. You could increase one if you radically decrease the others. But at some point, in broad terms, what you're spending has to reflect the tax receipts that you're getting in over the medium to long term. And that umbilical cord just seems to have been snapped and ignored. And I think that is fiscally irresponsible on the face of it. And I don't really think it's fair, as I say, because private sector workers who deserve a pay rise for some of their heroics, well, that will depend on the wider state of the economy. Public sector workers, to some degree, seem insulated by that. And it is true to say that public sector pay has lagged for the last 10 years or so. But overall, I mean, I couldn't find the exact number, but the IFS reckons that on a like-for-like comparison, public sector workers, perhaps, I'm going back to 2017 here, earn about 3% more for equivalent jobs in the public sector than the private sector. And of course, their jobs are enormously more secure. So what I'm worried about is that we will have hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people in the private sector who won't just have a pay freeze, who will find themselves being made redundant later this year, their income falling to naught other than what they're entitled to on welfare. And this stark economic reality just doesn't seem to apply if you're in the 20% or so who are on the government payroll. And I think that is deeply worrying, problematic, and unfair.
I mean, you would certainly think that would be the case, never mind the judiciary, but teachers have basically just had 3 months off, right? I mean, some of them, obviously, some have been working very hard, but you see reports that actually many schools, children haven't had the engagement from teachers. They're getting a pay rise as well. Chris, let me just bring you in for a second. Mark seems very pessimistic there. How the hell are we going to pay for any of this?
By printing money, basically. And I think Mark's article was very sensible, but it was almost eccentric and heretical in the current environment. I think one of the things that the left seem to have largely won the debate on is the magic money tree. Basically, the idea that you can print money without any real cost, more or less indefinitely, is no longer the preserve of a few Corbynistas, Richard Murphy, and so on. It's fairly mainstream. The idea that interest rates are low, therefore we can borrow, particularly for infrastructure projects. No one ever really mentions what these infrastructure projects are, apart from HS2. And essentially, the government will inflate the money away. So they would say that Mark's wrong about the what I would consider a basic economic fact, that borrowing is just taxation deferred. They say, no, we'll just inflate it away. Well, maybe you can up to a point. I mean, maybe we'll actually have a lot of inflation and we'll have to put up interest rates. And then where does this brilliant plan leave you? But yes, you can inflate the money away to a certain extent. But what you also do is you inflate people's savings away. And this is a thing that doesn't get talked about enough with so-called borrowing, which we should really call money printing, because that's all it is. There has been nowhere for the last 12 years or so for you to put your money safely away for your retirement. If you save up money during the course of your career, normally In normal times, you could put it into a bank account or into an ISA, and it's going to pay at least more than the rate of inflation. You're not actually going to lose money. It has been impossible to do that. For most of the last 12 years, there's been the odd moment when inflation has been extremely low, but basically it's been impossible to do that unless you essentially gamble it. So you can gamble it on the stock market, you can gamble it on gold or Bitcoin, these things. And for quite a long time, the stock market looked like a pretty good bet. Investments, very good. And actually, that's where all the inflation from QE went. It went into inflating the stock market. House prices is the other one, of course. They've been rocketing up because there's nowhere to put your money sensibly. There's no, you can't just squirrel it away in a bank account. But then the stock market crashed, and so we saw the fallacy of that. Gold and Bitcoin are pretty unreliable. And effectively, it's the savers who pay the price for this policy. It's the savers who get ripped off. And it's the savers who pay. So this is not by any means free money. And that's even before we get onto the massive amount of interest that we pay on the debt every year, which is about £50 billion. Top that up for the last 12 years, you can build a hell of a lot of hospitals.
Mark, just coming back to you, one of the things you focus on in the piece is the impact that I don't think we talk about enough of the triple lock on pensions, which in short basically means that pensioners over the coming years are likely to get a much better deal than the working age population, especially those who aren't in the public sector, because pensions are going to be boosted by the triple lock, while at the same time workers are going to be hit with static salaries or potential unemployment, tax rises and possible price rises and possible tax increases in order to pay for it all. How about we have a triple lock on government spending instead? If receipts are going to fall, surely that needs to be reflected in spending.
Yeah, I touched on this a little bit. I think it's important to sketch out the absurdity of the state pension triple lock, which is a ratchet effect on spending, but I also think is unfair. So the rule is that the state pension goes up by the price rise, or by 2.5%, or by wage growth, whichever is the greatest of those. So just imagine, I'll oversimplify, but some parallel universe in which wages go up simply because everybody in their 20s, 30s, and 40s has decided to work twice the hours, 4 times as productively, morning, noon, and night. That's suddenly reflected in my dad's pension. Nothing to do with him at all, even if prices are flat. So why should he be the beneficiary of that? I can understand the case of pegging it to inflation. You can understand that. You would say, right, we'll track RPI or CPI, but it goes up by the highest of the three. And the particular absurdity there is that you can imagine, I give an extreme case in the article. I'm not sure that this will happen, but you could imagine, for sake of argument, that wage growth this year will be, let's say, minus 20%, extreme case. Well, that wouldn't affect anybody on a state pension as far as their state pension is concerned, because let's assume inflation is 2%. Okay, they get the 2%. Then imagine next year, wages will bounce back. Let's just assume this perfect V-shaped recovery. And next year we get wage growth of 25%. Now, for you as a wage earner, all that's happened is it's gone down from 100 to 80 and then back up to 100. You're just back where you started from. But if that's reflected down the line, that's suddenly a boost to the state pension. So none of this really mattered that much if wage growth, inflation, and 2.5% were all clustered together. But the minute one of those goes out of sync, the unfairness of the situation arises. Now, on your question, Emma, about could we have some sort of overall aggregate lock on public spending, I'm really interested in that idea. And some other countries have constitutional structures in place or balanced budget amendments or the like. I can remember before he became Chancellor of the Exchequer as a backbencher, I think it was, Sajid Javid toyed with the idea of how might we change the rules in some way to try and bake in fiscal responsibility. It's extremely difficult to do given the UK constitution, one of untrammeled parliamentary sovereignty, basically. So I think you could put some protocols in place. You could have some system whereby, I don't know, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has to come and account to the House of Commons every 4 days or something if he's overspending. But a lot of it would be political theatre. So what's really needed, though, I think, is for people in public office, our political leaders, to be a little bit more honest about this. And because we don't have strictures in place that prevent overspending, and because there's a temptation for politicians to think in terms of the immediate electoral cycle of 4 or 5 years rather than the next generation, you really do need politicians to exercise perhaps greater fiscal responsibility and to be more attentive to it than you might need from political leaders in other countries if they're constitutionally constrained. So I would be, I think, in favour, or it's my second best scenario, because I would like to see a lot more flexibility in wage setting rather than having some central planner punch numbers into a spreadsheet. I'd like to see it devolved enormously so we can actually work out who of these 900,000 workers deserves perhaps more than a 3% pay rise and who doesn't. But in the absence of that, I would like there to be some agreement or protocol that, in very rough terms, because it's not as simple as this, but the money coming in needs to roughly equal the money going out. There are differences. A government isn't like a household. If you are confident, although the last 15 years might tell you otherwise, but if you're confident that there's going to be consistent economic growth of 2.5% a year, you can borrow. In the same way, if you were confident your salary was going to continue to rise every single year until you died, it wouldn't matter if you were overspending a bit this year. So to that extent, countries and governments aren't quite the same. But nevertheless, we haven't just pushed the envelope on spending, we've ripped it to shreds. I'm with Chris in this regard, that the level of overall fiscal responsibility is woeful, frankly, and we've got into a pattern. I mentioned this in the article. It's now 2 decades since we ran a budget surplus. 2001 was the last time any chancellor managed that. So we seem to have got into a pattern in which, if you like, in the relatively good times, we run modest budget deficits, and in the relatively bad times, we run colossal budget deficits. Well, I don't say that that's going to mean that the country goes bust immediately, but clearly over the very long run, that isn't really a sustainable way of doing business. You can run deficits when times are bad, but to some degree need to offset that with surpluses when times are good. That sort of essential Keynesian rule has gone out the window. Keynes would be spinning in his grave that we just borrow and borrow and borrow and spend, and no surpluses are ever run up. And we're obviously many, many years away from a budget surplus, I would hazard.
So, Mark, you've outlined what seems like a very sensible plan to put the public finances on a diet and stop swallowing up endless amounts of taxpayers' money. But if that's depressed you, don't reach for the cakes and cheer yourself up, because the government seems determined to put the rest of us on a diet as well. Chris, I'm going to bring you in here. You've written for The Spectator on the proposed schemes as we understood them last Friday that the government had introduced to tackle obesity. That included bans on promotions in shops, like buy one, get one free, on so-called junk foods, no advertising on TV before 9 p.m. There were rumours about no online advertising for these foods at all. Summarise, if you can, the worst offenders for the government's obesity strategy and what came out over the weekend that we didn't know on Friday.
The worst bits are, well, all the stuff that...
All of it.
Well, all of it, yeah, really. No, there are a few bits that are okay, but I mean, the kind of coercive stuff, the anti-market stuff, the nanny state stuff that first emerged with actually Cameron. It was buried, and then Theresa May brought it back, and then it was sort of half buried, and now pretty much all of it and more is in this new plan. The worst aspect, specifically the advertising ban before 9 p.m, the dictating to shopkeepers where they can stock certain foods, that they can't keep so-called junk food at the entrance, the exit, and the end of aisles. Huge amount of space in supermarkets, a lot of space in a normal small shop, in fact. And the bog-off ban, the ban on buy one, get one free, which I gather even Nicola Sturgeon has now turned against. She announced this a couple of years ago, much to the dismay of a lot of people on Twitter, at least, that I saw, and I gather she's now decided it's not a very clever idea. The newest bit, which I don't think had been rumoured, is actually probably the worst. The more I think about it, it's the worst. It's the total ban on online advertising. This is a big deal. I mean, first off, I need to explain, and I kind of tire myself out saying this all the time, but it's not junk food. The government and the media have sold us a pig in the poke with this talk about junk food. It is not what any normal person would consider to be junk. It includes anything that just has quite a bit of sugar or salt or fat, or indeed just calories in it. So it includes a huge range of foods that are not from American fast food chains, which is what people basically think of when they think of junk food. Banning it on television before 9 p.m. is a problem, particularly for the commercial broadcasters. I guess it has a negative effect on advertising agencies and creatives as well. But banning it online, I mean, the digital advertising sphere is already very big, very important, particularly, for example, to newspapers. So maybe they'll rue the day they supported all this stuff. But it's growing as well, and it's going to be, if it's not already, the biggest sector of the advertising industry for many, many years to come. It's also where smaller companies do their advertising. It's generally Big Food that advertises on ITV during the X Factor. But any company, let's say, for example, you make jam, you're a local jam company, and you want to have a little display ad on your local newspaper website. Can't do that at any time of day, ever now, thanks to this law. Same applies if you make sausages, if you make pies, if you're the local fish and chip shop, the local takeaway. None of these guys can advertise online at all at any point. It's really, really crazy, really damaging to these businesses. And people haven't realized that yet. People still think it's about McDonald's not being able to advertise on ITV. So I think that kind of surprise element that's come in seemingly at the last minute, that will have the worst consequences in the long term.
I mean, it is just worth reiterating, as you said, the media and the government have used the term junk food because it's the easiest way to explain what they're talking about. But it's things like jam, like you mentioned, mayonnaise, soy sauce, rice cakes. It's completely bizarre things that no one would ever consider junk food. Mark, I think you wanted to ask Chris a question.
Yeah, I hope Chris can help me on this. Is that I actually don't begin to understand how online advertising restrictions are enforced. I mean, we're broadcasting on YouTube at the moment. I'm not even sure where that's hosted. But I mean, how can the UK government stop me going onto a Facebook page that somebody in California and then somebody from down the road is selling me jam via that site? Do you see what I mean? I mean, I appreciate that as media is broken up, it's ever more complicated to, distinguish between foreign media and domestic media. But you at least have a kind of a handle on what a British television station is, or a poster site, or a newspaper. But I don't know how they're going to stop strawberry jam being advertised online if the online host is extraterritorial.
I think a few years ago that would have been a very serious concern. I'm sure there are still ways around this on blatantly foreign websites and so on. But the government has got better and better at regulating the internet, as we've seen with ludicrous things like GDPR. So Facebook, for example, or YouTube, they will be told by the government what the rules are. Anything that's viewed in this country from a UK IP address, and they will enforce it. I'm quite sure that the big tech giants will make sure that the law is abided by. Yeah, there might be some other websites that slip through the net, but actually, the UK is getting better and better at enforcing its own domestic laws with these companies. So I think it will be difficult for any of these organizations to do much in the way of advertising. The devil may be in the detail. They might have might have second thoughts about this once the consultation goes through, but I think it's looking pretty grim. And there's no other country in the world that I know doing anything like this. They're nothing on the same scale at all.
And Chris, could you also? There's another. Sorry, Emma. I had another question I wanted to ask Chris. Can you tell me what the difference is between a buy one get one free offer and a 50% off offer? Are you still able to sell confectionery at 50% off, but you can't say if you buy one Mars bar, we'll give you a second?
Yeah, you spotted the flaw in this policy, haven't you, straight away? Exactly. Of course, you can do that. I suppose the government would say that, well, firstly, they're not going to start controlling prices in the kind of way that would be required to stop discounting, per se. It'd be very difficult. You'd have to prove what the actual original price was. They would say that these kind of offers encourage excess quantities being bought, whereas a discount doesn't to the same extent. So for a bog off, you have to buy two when you really only wanted one, and then you eat twice as much as you would, and that would be their thinking. But yeah, the response of the industry, the retail industry, presumably will be to discount these things by 50% when he wants to get shot at. So it won't work, and none of this stuff's going to work. Obviously, I'm not saying that, but that will mean that the next demands from the likes of Jamie Oliver will include that kind of stuff. Oh my God, we found this loophole here. Companies are still advertising after 9 p.m. and actually quite a few teenagers still watching. So let's have a total ban. Or companies are discounting their food and getting around the multi-buy ban. This is never going to end. This is what my piece in the Spectator was. Oh, actually, in the Telegraph I wrote two, but in the Telegraph I wrote one about this is just a runaway train now. We've started this precedent. There is no obvious end in sight. These policies aren't going to work, and rather than repeal them, we're going to be in a position where we have campaigners moaning on and making ultimatums forever, the rest of our lives, certainly.
I mean, you'll have both seen today that, unsurprisingly, Jamie Oliver is delighted. He did do a lot of interviews welcoming the news, so it's a joy for us all.
I'm very happy for it. I'd love to see him looking happy.
Someone has to be, right? Mark, there couldn't be a clearer example of incoherent government here, could there? On the same day that we're banning advertising for Kit Kats before 9 o'clock, the government has revealed a database, a really helpful one that you search by postcode, of restaurants that we can head to Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays in August for taxpayer subsidies on our dinner. Like, what is going on? How is this incoherence happening?
Well, I mean, it's because, politics is ever thus, right? I mean, if you're looking for logical consistency, pick up a book on logical consistency. Don't ask politicians to find it. But it does seem to me completely absurd. I mean, Chris has just pointed out some of the absurdity here, although I think rightly says this will just be a gateway to further restrictions. But it does seem to me, I mean, can you use this? You can use this 10 quid government voucher at McDonald's or Pizza Hut.
Yeah.
You can, yeah.
Right.
KFC,
so the government's policy at the moment is to make sure that I can't hear about Pizza Hut or McDonald's, but if I really keep my ear to the ground and my sort of friends in the sort of black market tell me that these places are open, then Rishi Sunak will subsidise me having an extra large pepperoni pizza with double cheese on it. I mean, it's ludicrous. It's completely ludicrous. I mean, I'm obviously libertarian on people making up their own decisions. I mean, I just don't believe that people change their behaviour according to how things are wrapped. I mean, I've noticed chocolate gets smaller and smaller. Mars bars were a decent size when I was a kid, so I just eat 3 now. And I imagine most rational people who want their fix of chocolate do the same. But it does seem ridiculous that you're banning the advertising of something on the one hand and using taxpayers' money to subsidise it on the other. I mean, don't expect me to defend or explain that. That's just politics for you, I guess.
It's just inexplicable. Chris, you said that it wasn't all bad. So are there some redeeming features, a few sensible ideas hidden within the government's announcements?
There's a bit of stuff about physical activity and encouraging people to cycle, which I don't think is too objectionable. And there's some stuff about calorie labeling, which I think in principle is fine, although I don't think it's going to make a great deal of difference to very much in the long run. So most packaged food has the calories, the calorie count on it. That's actually not a law. As I understand it, as EU members, we couldn't actually make that law. And it's the same with alcohol labeling. It was an EU competence. So we couldn't put anything on alcohol bottles, even if we wanted to. And now we can. So the government wants to have calorie labeling on alcohol, and it wants to have calorie labeling on menus in restaurants. Calorie labeling on alcohol is an interesting one. It's, I think, a perfectly good idea. I think most economists should be in favour of it. It gives people information. I think there genuinely is a bit of a knowledge gap. I don't think people appreciate that there are 220 calories in a pint of beer, for example. And this might make people think about switching to different drinks or even drinking a bit less. On the other hand, it is, I think, plausible that for some weight-conscious individuals, they might decide to skip tea before they go out drinking, or they might switch to vodka rather than wine or beer and end up drinking more vodka. Now, that's not my problem. It's maybe an unintended consequence from the health lobby's perspective, but as far as I'm concerned, they're just making rational decisions in the light of new information. The calorie counts on menus. My objection to this, and I wrote about this 2 years ago, was simply a practical one. that if you're a small pub or restaurant, you want to have a new dish of the day, you want to change your menu around regularly. Can you really afford to have a scientific analysis done on your meals? Can you make sure your chef is always going to serve exactly the same portion so you're not breaching the law? And I was pleased to see that the government has kind of taken that on board, and it's now only applying this law to companies that have more than 250 employees. So actually, I don't think this is going to make a lot of difference. It leaves a whole massive area of the sector untouched. A lot of the companies like McDonald's, Burger King, Starbucks are already doing the calorie counts already. So I don't see too many practical problems with that. So actually, I think it's fine. No real objection. But that's about as good as it gets, I'm afraid.
Chris, we've got a question from our viewers on YouTube. Do you think a government strategy addressing obesity is justified at all? And if so, what would a sensible one look like?
I'm not sure it is unless you've got evidence of significant market failures. I've given you a possible example there, information asymmetry. People are systematically misinformed or undereducated about how many calories there are in a product. I think maybe there's justification for the government to step in and say, as a company, you have a responsibility to give people, what is useful and important information. But beyond that, not really. I mean, the supposed market failure that's always brought up is the cost of the NHS. But if you look at spending in the round, it's not at all clear that obesity creates any net externalities. There are costs, of course, with treating obesity-related conditions, but obese people pay their taxes too. And if they weren't obese, they would have to have some other condition treated. And they're, on average, not alive as long as people who are not obese, and therefore there'll be savings there from the government's perspective. So I think the evidence that there is a significant cost to the government overall, there may well be a net cost to the NHS specifically, but when you factor in welfare and pensions and so on, very far from clear that there is an externality there. And if there were, I'd prefer it was dealt with through Pagovian taxes. The trouble there is, what do you actually tax? We tax sugary drinks, but are obese people drinking that many sugary drinks? Most of them drink Diet Coke, as far as I can see. As Trump said, I've never seen a slim person drinking Diet Coke. What do you tax? Televisions, sofas? Quite difficult. But fortunately, I think the externalities are so minor, one way or the other, that it's really not worth the government's time worrying about it.
Mark, I suspect you possibly agree. Do you think the only sensible, government strategy on obesity is not a strategy?
Well, I mean, Chris is quite right that when you have healthcare provided in the way that we provide it in the UK, it's very difficult to actually say, well, everything's a matter of individual choice, because your unhealthy habit hits the NHS expenditure, and that therefore apparently gives me a justification to intervene in your unhealthy life and to insist that you become healthier. I mean, what I don't know about, and Chris might be able to enlighten us on this, is the scale of the problem here. I mean, I looked at a chart on the BBC website earlier. I think it may have been from Public Health England. I'm not sure. It was some health survey, which does show that the number of obese people has grown modestly in the last 10 years, a bit of a spike before that. The number of overweight people, which I think is less problematic than being obese, that's gone down a bit. So it looked to me as if people have fallen from the overweight category into the obese category. But I think, Chris, it may have been you, it may have been another IEA colleague who was telling me earlier that even if these various advertising bans, banning buy one, get one free, all of this, even if all of it hits the targets that the government has set themselves, we save 0.0175% of the NHS budget. I mean, it does seem completely tiny, trivial and petty.
That was Matt Hancock, and he was saying that if everybody lost, I think, 5 kilograms, then the NHS would save £100 million over 5 years. £5.
£5, not 5 kilograms.
Going imperial, okay. But if everybody did that, including presumably people who are severely malnourished, I don't know, but if everybody did that, the NHS would save £100 million over 5 years, £20 million a year. Imagine the difference that would make to the £200 billion NHS budget. And he wasn't.
So that's about 30p a person per year.
Very small amount of money, yeah. And he wasn't actually saying that this strategy is going to bring about £5 of weight loss at all. It's just a figure he just plucks out of the air. Presumably hoping that people would infer that that's what he was going to do. The actual impact assessment for this, which is an absolute joke, and if you're into these things, I recommend having a bit of a look at it. I mean, it's just guesswork piled upon guesswork, and no real evidence for anything at all. The impact assessment suggests that if the government does all the things that it's now planning to do, it will reduce calorie consumption by 17 calories a day fewer. And the government also says that most people, I think they probably mean most overweight or obese people, but most people are consuming 200 to 300 more calories a day than they should be doing. So
how much is 17 calories? What is that in terms of how many Smarties is that?
Was it like a Pringle or something?
It's not many. It's walking up and down the stairs a few times, really.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to do that. I think with the lockdown
we're used to that, yeah.
Well, exactly. Also, I mean, with this lockdown weight gain, I'll lose my £5. I'll lose the £5 for someone else, but I don't think I need the government to tell me that. I think I'd work that out on my own. We started this conversation by talking about, taxpayer spending. We will end it with taxpayer spending, which is to try and bring some optimism to this conversation, because I always talk to you two and end up feeling slightly pessimistic about the future. Is there a chance that this is the sort of death throes for Public Health England? Is it their final hurrah before actually people go, you have fundamentally failed when it comes to the coronavirus? We need to abolish Public Health England because it can no longer do its job. Chris, am I just being naive and optimistic?
I like the idea that it's the last hurrah. I mean, it has been staggering, really, that Public Health England, having failed on every single front during this pandemic, is being effectively rewarded by having its long-standing policy aims fulfilled by a Conservative government. It's really amazing. However, I think there are still knives out for Public Health England. Its predecessor, the Health Protection Agency, which did a very good job, actually, and was focused purely on contagious diseases and environmental hazards, that only lasted 10 years. Public Health England's only been around 7 years. It couldn't have failed more spectacularly on the one real public health crisis it's had to deal with. And let's face it, the government is also looking for scapegoats. And it is the obvious one because it genuinely is guilty. So it's possible, yes. I mean, I like the cut of the jib. It's possible that this could be a kind of retirement present for them.
Mark, do you think we'll see the back of Public Health England after this?
I'm not so sure, really. I mean, there is one food substance that I'd like Public Health England to spend all of its time considering, and that's not Mars bars or McDonald's or pizza or Pringles. It's bat soup coming out of China from a wet market. If they're telling us anything other than about bat soup coming out of China, I don't want to hear from them. Bat soup, or whatever the hell it was that spread this disease, is just so monumentally worse than whether you eat an extra Pringle or eat an extra Smartie or only have one Mars bar rather than two. That at the very least, I hope that they are given a shake and told to actually focus all of their efforts on pandemics, something that's caused just in recent months tens of thousands of deaths in the United Kingdom, rather than focusing all of their efforts to make sure that we can't see an advertisement for strawberry jam on Facebook. There certainly needs to be a pretty urgent reprioritization of their resource allocation, I would humbly suggest.
I mean, that probably actually answers our question from YouTube. If we're going to have a government strategy on what we should and shouldn't be eating, it should start and end with stay away from the bat soup. Mark, Chris, thanks very much for joining me. Thanks to all you viewers for watching and listening. Don't forget, while you're here, you can subscribe to the IEA London YouTube channel to never miss a video. You can also visit the IEA website to donate and support our work and to sign up to our regular Sunday newsletter. Thanks very much.